Knock at the Cabin is M. Night Shyamalan's latest film and it released just over a month ago. It received mixed reviews, which is nothing new for Shyamalan, but I think personally, people are severely underrating it. Now yes, it is known that I'm a bit of a M. Night fanboy, so of course I like it, but let me be clear, I don't like every film the man has done, and even with some films that I do like or even love, I understand why people wouldn't. But Knock at the Cabin is a bit harder to conceptualize what people don't really like about it. So I ventured to the most reliable hub of intellectual film analysis, Letterboxd, and from what I could see, people were upset because they didn't understand what the film was getting at or they misinterpreted the film in my opinion. So for starters, let's get into some of the themes and see how they're conveyed. First of all, the obvious, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Now, biblically speaking, the four horsemen represent conquest, war, famine, and death, or alternatively, depending on the testament you're reading, sword, famine, wild beasts, and pestilence or plague. Now, it's easy to attach some of these to our characters. Say we go with the first and more popular version of the horsemen. Redmond is war. He's hot-headed, he's built on rage and anger, impatience, but most importantly, intolerance. But he plays as the opposite of this representation because in the current he's seeking repentance. He's trying to make amends with himself and assumedly his God. Sabrina is death. Being a nurse, she's surrounded by it, but again is represented as its antithesis because she's paid to prevent it. She's compassionate and helps those in need, even our protagonists. Adrian is famine, playing as the polar. She's a chef, she feeds the world and her community, she even feeds Wen. And Leonard is conquest. Though he represents this perfectly within the situation, he takes control by force and runs the operation, but in general he's again contrary to the definition because he's a teacher. And he coaches a team which he admits loses quite often, but they have fun and that's what matters to him. He despises conflict and has a resentment of harming others. So as you can see, all these characters perfectly match the typical four horsemen whilst also opposing the ideologies of them. But what's most unique about their representation is that the four horsemen in the biblical sense are a critique on the human race. They're a critique from John of Patmos' point of view, but one of our protagonists, Eric, views the horsemen as malice, nurturing, healing, and guidance. John believes the horsemen were there to enact the apocalypse or represent what the apocalypse looks like, whereas Eric sees the horsemen as what can save us from the apocalypse. Each member of this cult or shared vision or whatever label you want to attach them to represents something that can save us from each other. Malice is Redmond, of course, which may seem harsh since, yes, he wishes ill will upon people, but the very fact he is there is proving his willingness to change. His impatience for it is a problem and his lack of compassion may just simply serve as a warning though. Something to avoid because things like intolerance fester inside you like a disease that you never fully recover from. Despite this, he's attempting to change though, to make a difference. Adrian is nurturing, she has a son and parental nurture is essential to creating good humans. She's a cook and enjoys it. She takes care of Wen in this very obviously dire situation and is possibly the most compassionate. Sabrina is of course healing, the nurse that looks after Eric and doesn't want anybody to be harmed. Leonard then of course being guidance, similar to nurture but can come from any source from anywhere at any stage in life to push us towards a better future, a healthier way of being. This coming from his obvious teaching job, but also how he's leading the horsemen through this difficult time. And he's trying to help all those involved in saving humanity. He's trying to be a guide, and I think the way M. Night uses these characters to represent this and giving this overall message of love can save us all is very effective. It's a basic concept, but it's displayed very poetically, and the more you analyze it from this perspective, the ambiguity of it all becomes less. But as we all know, the horseman aspect of the film is very, very on the nose. It's very surface level, so we know that. But let's talk about some of the least spotlighted and underappreciated themes, starting with the metaphor of the grasshoppers. It's a simple one, but effective. Wen captures grasshoppers in her jar to study them, but with the promise that she'll let them go and set them free once she's gotten what she wants from them. Leonard shares, or at least shared this hobby when he was younger, professing that he was always quite good at it. This serves allegorically for the family being captured and trapped in this unknown house with the promise of leaving once their business is done. The horsemen also affirm that they mean no harm or any ill will on the family, only what they've been asked to ensure. This film shows the innocent act of grasshopper catching from the perspective of the grasshopper, which seems a lot less innocent. I think it's a unique way to telegraph how simple perspective can entirely change the feeling of a story. The relationship between a grasshopper and a grasshopper catcher is a great way to explain this story in the most simplest of terms. This film is full of symbolism like this though. Like when Leonard initially knocks on the door, he knocks specifically 7 times. Now, again, biblically speaking, the number 7 represents many things. God rested on the 7th day. It's a number that represents perfection. It also represents the 4 corners of the world united with the Holy Trinity. In the book of Revelations, where the 4 horsemen originate from, there are 7 churches, 7 angels, 7 trumpets, 7 stars, and 7 seals. In Islam, there are 7 heavens, and Muslim pilgrims walk around the Kaaba 7 times. Hindus believe there are 7 higher worlds and 7 lower worlds. Buddhists say the new Buddha rose and took 7 steps, and outside religion, in general we associate 7 with luck and even magic, but I think the 7 may represent 2 things mostly. I think as mentioned it represents the 7 seals. The opening of the first 4 seals unleashed the 4 horsemen, the 5th unleashes martyrs, the 6th unleashes plagues, storms and cataclysmic events, and finally the 7th seal when opened unleashes 7 angelic trumpeters who unleash the 7 bold judgments. That sounds very familiar, doesn't it? But I also think the 7 knocks represent the 7 deadly sins. Sins that are rife within the modern world and if committed represent the death of your soul. To amend for this you must confess and do penance, which I think is what the horsemen are directly doing when the family doesn't make a decision. But also I think the family are chosen to do penance on behalf of humanity. There's some strong themes here which are buried within such simple moments of grasshopper catching and knocking. Next, I'd like to talk about M. Night's interpretation of the source material. If you didn't know, this is based on the book The Cabin at the End of the World. As somebody who has read this book, I can say certifiably that this adaptation is better than the original work. The source material is great in its own right, but distinctly the ending is the most absolute failure of it. If you didn't know, the book ends with a tussle for a gun between Leonard and Andrew, and in this, Wen is shot and killed. Since it was an accident, it doesn't avert the apocalypse and doesn't nullify the need for Eric and Andrew to make a decision. This causes Sabrina to lose faith in the mission. She kills Leonard and helps Eric and Andrew leave in a car with Wen's body. This ending actively harms all the work that the author put in throughout the book to build a compelling case for and against humanity. I'm glad M. Night didn't go with the book ending for sure. It's exceptionally unsatisfying and ambiguous. There isn't much to leave the reader with, nothing to reflect on, and it feels like it relies solely on shock value. There are no lessons and the themes become numb for the sake of depressing the audience, whereas the film actually leaves the audience with something. It resolves in a way that allows the viewer to draw meaning from the situation. It keeps up themes and presents questions, which I think is a far more satisfying ending. If the film had killed Wen and Eric and Andrew survive, refusing to kill each other, the apocalypse arrives and that's all, what is the meaning? It's inherently narratively weak because it kills its own themes in favour of surprising the audience. Which is quite funny since Shyamalan is known for twists, for taking a story in a place where you wouldn't expect. Yet he chooses the less shocking ending and opts in for a more conventionally satisfying ending this time because he understands that going with the original ending sends a harmful message. It tells us a story of only loss, which are always important of course, but when it comes to stories of Armageddon, we've come to expect them to be stories of warning, stories of hope, stories of seeing the worst in humanity but equally the best. We get that in Knock at the Cabin. We get to see all sides equally, and in the end, Eric sacrifices himself for not only his family but for everyone because he finally believes in the Horseman's mission and absolving his family of making the horrific decision. His love for his daughter and partner are what prevent the apocalypse. The simple act of loving one's family was enough to save the world. I think that's exceptionally powerful and beautiful. Next, I want to talk about the LGBTQ+ representation since this film has had a lot of talk about whether it's homophobic or not. I personally land on the side that it is massively pro-LGBTQ+. Because for one, we've just assessed that everyone is saved by Eric's love, proving that it's just as valid, just as equal and powerful as straight love. Plus, Eric and Andrew are presented as being excellent parents to Wen. They instill great values in her that are seen in a vision to live with her for her entire life. This film also commentates on queer trauma. Andrew, being a human rights lawyer, only aids him in his line of thinking since he's only ever experienced intolerance due to his sexuality. His parents weren't accepting of his lifestyle. He was assaulted in a bar, and now with this home invasion, he inherently believes it's because of this. He's a human rights lawyer, so he's truly seen the worst humanity has to offer, so why would this be for anything virtuous? Eric, on the other hand, is less confrontational and more understanding of other people's ignorance. He's the yin to Andrew's yang, and it's an interesting method of presenting how PTSD can fester in different people who share a lifestyle but have lived through vastly different experiences. Andrew does eventually learn that not everybody is out to get him. Eric proves that to him by making his sacrifice and proving that the 4 invaders were in fact telling the truth. So though he is not magically cured of his trauma and he's not suddenly okay, he learns to trust more, to love more and to understand more, which was what made Eric strong enough to make his decisions. It's some of the best representations of love I've seen in modern media. And I think believing this film is anti-gay love is a complete misunderstanding of what it was trying to convey. Finally, I wanted to look at how the framing and camera work of this film beautifully tell the story of this cautiously optimistic tale through visuals and not just dialogue. For a start, in the very beginning when Leonard meets Wen, he's standing over her, very clearly showing his size and power in the situation. But as he talks to Wen and makes her more comfortable with his being, he lowers himself to her level. They share a love for catching grasshoppers, and this shared hobby is what makes Leonard come down to eye level with Wen, and once he is, they conversate. M. Night shoots this conversation on Dutch angle close-ups, showing that the conversation is intimate, personal, but that something isn't quite right, that something is off, which of course it is. It's a subtle but delicate way to present the power dynamics and Leonard's intentions forthwith. Next, we have this sequence where the 4 invaders try to explain who they are. It's framed in 3 separate angles, one with Eric and Andrew, one with 3 of the horsemen, and one with Redmond. Shyamalan positions Redmond off-center for a start, representing his internal conflict and disorientation, but also removing him from the others, showing he is not only different from them, but also nearly directly opposing them. He shares the visions, he shares their goals, but does not share their methods and ideologies. But when it's time for Eric, Andrew and Wen to make their decision, Redmond joins the shared frame because this is where their minds meet and become alike. He didn't believe in telling the family who they were. He was impatient and forceful as opposed to the rest who thought it was important, thus they were separated. Then once the goal of the moment became presenting the ultimatum to the family, Redmond joins the frame since they've become a unit again. Directly after these shots, we get a few shots of Leonard framed in between Andrew and Eric, some even using Leonard to obscure the other from view. This is to represent each of their approaches to the situation, one empathetically and wanting to understand, one aggressively and refusing to reason. But what's most interesting about this framing to me is the position of Wen. The entire time she's positioned behind Andrew, more than likely foreshadowing the end where they're the only survivors. This could also be interpreted as Leonard coming in between them and showing them separately for who they really are. There are tons of examples of great framing, but for the sake of time I'm going to focus on just one more. The crescendo of the film, the moment when Eric is convincing Andrew to let him go. Using the door as a representation of them leaving the situation, but also the light source to highlight the journey they make to the final decision. They spin in circles and take turns in the light as they go back and forth with their opposing side of the debate. It eventually ends with Eric in the light ready to leave in an almost heavenly metaphor whilst Andrew is left in the dark. Unsure of his future, unsure of his philosophies and beliefs, and knowing exactly what has to be done. It's beautiful storytelling, and despite what you may feel of the movie, to call it poorly directed I think is one of the most egregious falsifications and takes away massively from the work of not just M. Night himself, but the cinematographers, the set designers, and even the actors who are giving unreal performances across the board to sell the vision of this film. I wanted to get around to talking about more things like the adaptation quality as a whole, but for time's sake I may have to keep all of this for future conversations. So for now, I'd like to ask you all what you thought of the film, what you thought of this video. I genuinely read every single comment and reply to as much as I can, so do continue the conversation below. I want to know whether this changed any of your thoughts or whether it confirmed any. I'd like to hear all perspectives, and whether it's this film or not, as always, keep watching movies.